When I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Steve Magness, a world-renowned performance coach, author, and expert on resilience, mental toughness, and high performance. He's coached Olympic athletes, consulted for elite military units, and helped top executives push their limits while avoiding burnout. You might know him from his books Do Hard Things, Peak Performance, and The Passion Paradox, where he breaks down the science of toughness and success in ways that challenge conventional wisdom. His latest book is Win the Inside Game. Today, we're diving deep into what mental fitness looks like, why grit isn't always the answer, and how we can build sustainable resilience in our lives. So here we go with Steve Magness on the X. This stat of you running essentially a 4-minute mile in high school is staggering to me. Like that is, so how did you come about running? Like, was this something because it sounds like from that book, you almost like fell into it. Like it wasn't something where like right from the get-go, it was like all about running. And it was kind of like, I'm kind of good at running. Maybe I should do this. So how'd you get into that and figure out you were that good at it?
That's exactly what happened. So I always loved sports growing up.
Yeah.
But it started with things like, baseball and basketball, and I wasn't that great at them. But then I found out I was pretty good at soccer and started playing travel soccer and fell in love with that sport and said, this is what I'm going to be good at, until I fell into running in the sense that like I ran junior high cross country and track, and I always knew I was fast. I always did well at the both the sprint and endurance events when you had to do the kind of PE physical fitness test stuff, but it didn't interest me. I wanted to play soccer.
Yeah. And that was my sport. I was a soccer player too. So
yeah. So there it goes. And that was my plan. I remember, again, I ran track in middle school, did well at it, well enough. But what happened is I was all set on soccer, and the high school track and cross country coach said, "Hey, why don't you run cross country in the fall? Because in Texas, soccer is a spring sport. Why don't you run cross country in the fall? And that'll get you in shape so you can make the soccer team and be better prepared there." And I said, "Great, this sounds logical to me. We'll do it." And the soccer coach happened to be an assistant coach on the cross country team. So I was like, great, I'll get in to know him as well. So what happened is, like, we had this family friend who was also on the cross country team, and he started taking me out for runs. And at first I was like, this kind of sucks. Like, this is hard.
I think that's how most people feel about running.
Yeah. It's like, this is miserable. And I remember multiple times being like, why am I doing this? And I remember my first actual practice of cross country is the coach took all the athletes coming off the summer break. We're getting ready to start the school year. And he said, "Hey, here's our top runner. I just want everyone to stick with him for as long as you can. And we'll just, note when you drop off, essentially." So it was like a game of survival. And at that point, I think the longest I'd ever run was something like, 5 miles maybe, which was a long way for me at that time.
Sure.
Is I made it 9.5 miles and then pulled over to the side and just puked. And one of the coaches, who I think was on a bike following us, I was the last guy to hang on, except for the senior who was the top runner. The coach on the bike stops with me and he says, "Steve, you have no clue how good you could be at this." And I was like, "I understand. I don't. I have no clue." And he said, "I know you want to play soccer, but like, give this running thing a shot." And then he sent me home with, like, at that time, it was like all these old videos of like running movies and races and like the Steve Prefontaine and
Yeah.
and stuff
Yeah.
like that, and I go home and I just start watching it. And eventually I kind of got hooked on the sport, was like, hey, I'm good at this. And I quickly made it to varsity, was one of our top runners, eventually our top runner my freshman year of high school. And that's where it took off, where I was like, hey, I'm good at this. And this is kind of enjoyable. It's more fun than I thought it would be.
Yeah. And so then at what point were you like, I might be able to run a 4-minute mile? Because again, that is not, I mean, we're talking about, Roger, what's his name?
Roger Bannister. Yeah.
Bannister. Thank you. Roger
Yeah.
Bannister, right? Like where, whatever that was 100 years ago or whatever, it was like, that can't even be done. And you almost basically did that in high school.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting because I was clueless. So I remember my freshman year of high school during track season, fast forward to track season. I just got better and better and better and better. And I think I ended up my freshman year of high school running like a 4:21 mile or so.
Yep.
And at that time, it was one of the top couple freshman times in the nation. And I remember my coach pulling me aside and saying again, he said, Steve, I want you to look up these people because you can do what they've done. And he gave me the name of a guy named Jim Ryan, who way back in the 1960 something, ran a sub 4-minute mile in high school. And he was the first high schooler to ever run sub 4 in high school. And he went on to win Olympic silver and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I go home, I look him up in the early days of the internet, and I come back and I'm like, you think I can run a sub 4-minute mile? He's like, absolutely. By your senior year, I think you have the talent to do that. And I was clueless. I didn't know. And what happened is over the next couple of years is like, I went from like doing the sport to falling in love with the sport to understanding it. And then my senior year of high school, I mean, he almost got the prediction right, is like my time just kept dropping until I ran a 4:01 mile and didn't quite get there, but like got as close as you can, which is still pretty cool.
It's just, I mean, like I can confidently say I will never be able to do that. And nor do I think I could have ever done it. I mean, some of this is talent, and I want to get into this a little bit with you because it's something I've heard you talk about. And I think like kind of just tracing your story, I think stopping on some of these points is that they applied in your own journey, I think is a good place to go. One comment I want to make just real quick though on cross country is, so we had a cross country team at my high school. The high school I ended up graduating from was a small kind of private high school in New England. And there's a cross country team, and those guys, it's like the worst spectator sport in history, because it was like they just go running off into the woods somewhere and then they come back at some point. It's like, I don't know where they went. There's no way to watch it. Right. It's just like, I don't know. They go running off into the woods. And it's so hard. And like, they're so like, to your point, so out of breath and like throwing up half the time. It's just like, it's a really mental thing. Right. And this is kind of what you talk about. By the way, did you ever break the 4-minute mark?
No,
you
never did. So that's the thing is I ran between 4:01 and maybe 4:05, a dozen times, but never ever got under that barrier, which drove me nuts at the time. But I think also I'm kind of thankful for it because it shaped how I view performance, and also kind of like made me wrestle with some stuff to be able to be like, that's okay. Like,
yeah. So let's hang on that point a little bit, because again, this is something I heard you talk about, and I have very strong feelings on this too, which is the interplay between talent and effort, basically, or talent and hard work, and where talent can benefit you, right? Like, so it helped you had a talent. And I think one thing that I want to make clear from my own perspective is talent is a thing, right? Like it is a thing in the sense that we have sort of a propensity to be a natural ability towards something or some things. And that's definitely true. But where I guess that's helpful for people, especially like people you work with, athletes that you've seen yourself, and where it can be harmful potentially too, where someone is super talented at something and that then can lead to sort of this inside game that they have to fight. just kind of like, I guess, talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, talent's a blessing and a curse. And I think where I'd start with this is if you look at the research on prodigies and phenoms and people who were labeled as like insanely gifted at whatever their pursuit is. It could be sports or running or math or science or whatever their talent showed, right? Is often what happens is that can propel us initially because we find out, hey, I'm pretty good at this. But if we only rely on that, if we only understand that, it can almost be this like trap. And I experienced this myself in the sense that you start to say, I am a runner. This is what I'm good at. This is what defines me. And you start to almost like seek that validation through the thing. So for instance, one of the reasons that I think I never broke the 4-minute mile is because in high school, what happened, I was combining talent with like enjoyment of the activity and the love of the sport. But once I got to a level where I was like, holy crap, like I've run a 401 mile in high school, something that only a handful of people in history have done. Like next level is trying to make the Olympics, trying to do XYZ, trying to do this. Is what happened is that got in the way of me even fulfilling the talent that I had. Because every single race became a test, not a test of can I explore my potential, but a test of like, can I validate essentially my sense of self or my self-worth by either accomplishing this goal and seeing a 3 something in front of the time when I finish or not, and feeling like, oh, I'm letting down myself, I'm letting down others, I'm not getting that thing that I so desperately want. And I think this is the interplay where, again, like talent is necessary for accomplishing anything, but anything great almost, but we need a baseline of some sort of talent. But at the same time, it can be the thing that gets us in the way from actually like exploring our potential. And this is kind of the nuance of performance that we never, or that we don't talk about enough. We just think like, oh, take the talented person, get them to work hard enough, and like the rest will work out. But it's like, no, that talent is like the blessing and curse that can like either narrow us and make us stop playing to win the thing and start making us to almost like play not to lose the thing.
Yeah. I've heard you talk too about where it's almost like the people that are the most talented at something are the people that can have these kind of like mental setbacks later in life, where you almost want, like, if you could pick, you almost want to be the person that is like one rung down from the most talented group, but puts a lot of effort into it. Why is that? Why is that the better group to be a part of?
There was a wonderful study that came out a couple of years ago that looked at professional athletes across a variety of sports, thousands of them. And it found, the quote is like, talent needs trauma is what they found. And not necessarily like big T trauma, like super traumatic, but what they meant is that those who at some point during their development went through some sort of, difficult failure or setback or injury or time where they kind of fell short and had to figure it out, they were more likely to make it to the top of the top because that early struggle built the tools that they needed to have the resilience of making it.
Right.
And so much what happens is, if you ask, why is that the second rung down? Because of 2 things. A, the expectations are just slightly lower. So they're more likely to experience failure because they're not like always going to be the best. If you're that top rung, often early on, what happens is you just get used to winning. And you're saying, I'm pretty good, I'm going to win again. And you don't have to go through that struggle until later when reality smacks you in the face. And because you didn't have anything to prepare you for it, it kind of sends you like off the edge because you're like, what the heck? I've always won everything. And now I'm not winning. Like, what's wrong with me? Well, if you
Yeah.
have that prep, you've gotten and developed those tools so that you can, utilize them over the long haul.
Now, are there famous athletes, or I guess maybe not celebrities, but let's say athletes that fall into those buckets that people would recognize? Like, this is a person who is like too talented, and it was a detriment in some regard. And here's somebody who's on that second tier. Do you think
Oh
of
man.
specific people?
Yeah, yeah. I think there absolutely are. I mean, I'm gonna struggle off the top of my head because I've sleep deprived with a newborn, but there are, and often what you see is it's the, I'll tell you this. Go look at some of the first round draft picks of, for instance, like
Okay,
NFL players,
good.
right?
Yep.
And you will see some of these guys who are phenomenal, right? They were stars in high school, they were stars in college. Maybe even you look at the Jamarcus Russell quarterback, from several years ago, who draft number 1. But what happens? He gets to NFL, and I think there's the famous story where the coaches with Russell, coaches sent film tape home to watch, and the tape was blank, so that when he came back, they said, "Hey, how was the tape?" And he starts telling them things, but they know he's making it up because he never
Wow.
watched the tape. And the point of that story is what happens. Well, he was always really freaking good.
Yeah.
So his talent was so high that even at the college level, he didn't have to quite learn to prepare at the level that he was going to eventually at the NFL, because everyone's good, right?
Yep.
So you see, again, many examples of these draft, busts essentially, who had the same amount of talent as other people around them, but couldn't translate to the next level. And often the case is that they never were challenged in a way, or never had to struggle or in a way, or could kind of skate by their talent, so that they never had to learn the skills to prepare, to learn how to bounce back from, getting your butt kicked in a game or a loss, and figuring out, okay, how do I overcome this and like up my game to get better at it. And I think that's what it is. And to a degree, I know the story is overtold, but like, you look at the Michael Jordan and like getting cut from his high school basketball team, and then like having to rise through the ranks a little bit in college, and then even not getting selected first overall, like he was third overall. And like, obviously the guy was super talented, but you can see these like little chips on his shoulder where it's like, okay, like this is forcing him to figure it out.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think you see that, quite often, whether it's same deal. If you look at, I could go all day now. If you look at like Steph Curry, undersized athlete. Yes, he obviously had his talent. His dad played in the NBA, right? But undersized guy who went to, I think it was Davidson, like not the super D1 program that everyone wants. Wasn't even drafted that high, and what did that do? It made sure he had the work ethic and ability to like, make it when he finally got there. So I think the examples abound. We've just got to look for them.
Tom Brady. So there's another one that comes to mind, right? Like exactly that scenario of just like, drafted low, but just had to keep working at it, right? By the way, I've always thought it's odd that we praise talent. I think it's such a strange thing. I see it all the time. You see it in like singing shows, or, The Voice or something like that, where they say it over and over, oh, you're so talented. And I just think it's the most bizarre thing. And have you ever thought about that? Like, I wish we could say that differently or something, because to me, it's like praising someone for being tall or having blue eyes or something. Like you're praising them for something they had nothing to do with. Right.
You're spot on. And I think that's a detriment, because think of how that person internalizes that.
Yeah.
Right. If I walk around and I say, hey, you're really tall, do I take that as like, oh, I've worked hard to get this tall? It's like, no, this is just something, God given that I end up with.
Right.
And I think what happens is we almost, again, getting back to that talent can be a blessing and curse. We've almost, if we tell someone that, we almost like curse them a little bit. Because what happens is we imply, hey, you're really talented. But that person who you say, hey, I'm really talented to, they internalize and think of it as, well, if I'm this talented, how come I haven't made it yet? Right.
Right. Yes.
And like that can get in your way. Instead, if we sat there and praised, the effort, or like, hey,
Right.
I see that you've really dedicated yourself, or I see that like this means a lot to you. That's something they can control. And in fact, my wife's an elementary school teacher, but they think and talk about this all the time because their whole thing is
Yes.
like,
With kids, for sure.
it's kids.
Yes.
We don't want to just say, hey, you're gifted.
Right.
What do we have to
so
do?
Smart, right? You're
Yeah.
so smart. It's like praise the effort they put into whatever it is.
Bingo. Because you want that, even if the kid quote unquote is smart, you want them to learn. Like the point is to
Yes.
try hard.
Right. Right.
Because if you try hard, then you're going to see how good you can be. You're going to see like you're going to maybe make something out of this talent. But if I just say you're smart, what does that tell that person? Oh, I guess
Exactly.
I'm
Guess
smart.
I'm good to go. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was that? How far did you take being an athlete, so to speak? Like how far did you take that?
Yeah, so I ran Division I in college, competed at a decent level, made nationals and stuff. Ran a little bit after that, but I was kind of the national class runner who could never break through to the next level. Was kind of my career.
Okay, and so at what point did you transition to coaching?
Yeah, so I transitioned to coaching. I started to dabble in it actually when I was in graduate school. So I went to graduate school for exercise physiology, mainly because I didn't know what I was going to do with my life and needed to do something. So I figured graduate school, let's extend the schooling a little bit. And during graduate school, I got I had a bunch of local high school cross country teams and runners say like, hey, you're in the area, you train at the same parks in the summer and during the school year, like, can you maybe help write some workouts and, guide us a little bit? And some of the coaches who didn't have experience. And I said, I mean, sure, like I can do that. And that was kind of the introduction to coaching. And it became something, especially in that narrow world of cross country track at first before expanding, that I kind of said, hey, this fills that void of competing to me. And this is another way to kind of like explore potential in a way that I can help others. And it really started, in earnest after I finished graduate school.
On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear. Known for their durability and comfort, Mechanics Wear gloves are made from top quality materials offering protection against impacts, cuts, and abrasions. They feature advanced breathability and moisture wicking technology to keep hands cool and dry during any task. Designed with precision, these gloves provide a secure grip and flexibility, helping users work more efficiently and safely. They've certainly been my personal go-to glove for decades. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, on mechanicswear.com, and on GSA Advantage. I would think, like a lot of coaches, you sort of start at initially it's about the physical stuff. It's about, okay, what are some techniques we can do to improve our endurance, or the running technique, or whatever it may be, right? Like that's primarily what kind of quote unquote human performance is all about. At what point along the line did you think, you know what, we got to bring some mental stuff into this too?
Yeah, you just explained my journey precisely.
Yeah, I feel like this to me, this transformation is part of like the zeitgeist right now of sort of like where we need to go. And I think more and more people are cluing into it, that it's like, I always use the example of, I see so many professional, because this is kind of my jam too. Like I really am into this, and I think it's for me and I come at it from sort of the special operations veteran standpoint, right? Because I think so much of where we fail, so to speak, as veterans is it's a mental thing, and it's like we know how to work out and eat well and do all, like we know that stuff, right? And despite all the kind of mental toughness stuff out there, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of other pieces to the puzzle that we need to work on. And so, and just to close out this thought real quick, not to cut you off, but the place I see it so often is with professional athletes like in the NFL, where I just think, okay, these dudes are so dialed in when it comes to their workout regimen and how they sleep and um, what they eat and their recovery schedule and all the tanks that they get in and the massages and everything. And then you see them flipping out on the sideline and throwing their helmet down. And you're like, that dude is so like, if he would put an ounce of effort into his mental game, like 10% of what he puts into his physical game, the improvements he would make would be astonishing, right? And the fact that they don't do that just baffles me. But anyway, yeah. So you're kind of like your epiphany, so to speak, on kind of coming to terms with like this needs to be worked on too.
You're spot on. Everything you said, 100% agreement, and it drives me nuts as well.
Yeah.
But I've been there because as an athlete, I think part of it is this. What you can control as an athlete, you tend to, especially if you're a striver and you're dedicated, you grasp onto that. And what are the easy things to control? The workouts I'm doing, right? The food I'm eating, the recovery things I'm doing. You grasp onto that because it feels like I'm doing the things that I need to do. I can literally see them and check the box. Okay. And that's what I believed as an athlete. And that's what I thought at the beginning of my coaching journey is I was like, I'm going to write the best workouts. I'm going to give the best, recovery plans. We're going to dial this in and be great. But what happens is when you get in that arena and you see individuals who have nailed all the workouts, done everything perfectly, but then they show up to race day and it's like they're a different person.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting here being like, who is this? Like,
right.
Johnny at practice should be winning. Johnny here is like, in 25th place. This doesn't compute. And I think the tendency in coaching is to almost say, like, I can't do anything about that.
Yeah.
In fact, we have a word for this that you hear many coaches still say is they'll label that person a head case.
Yep.
Which essentially absolves you from any responsibility to figuring it out because it's their head case, not my problem. I can't help them. Essentially, is how it goes. And early on in my career, I realized, I'm here to help these people. And so many of them, their problem is not the workouts. Their problem is not, lifting the weights or doing the runs on the track or what have you. Their problem is the 6 inches in between their ears.
Yep.
And how do we develop that mental skill set that often no one's ever taught or discussed with them? So it was like the light bulb moment where I just realized, like, if my goal is to help these athletes explore their potential, then I need to stop worrying so much about, the workouts and the physical side and worry about the mental side. And in fact, this is early on in my career. I mentioned my academic background was on exercise physiology, which is essentially what the workouts. How do we figure out the workouts? And I remember saying, you know what, I got to go back and I got to take some graduate level, sports psychology and mental performance courses and dive into reading and understanding this myself, because like, this is the thing. And that light bulb moment really kind of switched my career where I was like all obsessed with the physical to understanding like, no, we get in our own way because of the mental. And if we don't dial that in, we're never going to get anyone to reach their performance or potential.
Yeah. It's so funny about that thing you talked about, the head case, right? That guy's a head case thing. That also highlights another thing about our kind of mental health paradigm that I think is just completely wrong, which is putting people into a yes/no. It's a yes/no thing, right? So it's making a binary determination on someone's sort of mental fitness, which it would be like saying, okay, these guys on the team, they're all in shape and these guys are out of shape. And it's like, yeah, but that's not right. They're all in sort of like some level of fitness. And it's like they're on infinite, they could be in infinite locations there. There's not just like a box over here of guys that are in shape and out of shape. I mean, I suppose there's some point where you think you sort of cross that threshold, right? But the reality is, like, people on the team from their like sort of mental fitness aspect, it's the same thing. It's like, okay, this guy might be sort of struggling the most, but all the other players have some level of that too, right? Like, so like everybody could benefit from this thing. It's not like, oh, they're fine, and then this one guy's messed up. Like it may not like be as a parent, it might not, like, you might not see it as much, but there's some level of whatever it is. There's some level of anxiety or self-doubt or something that creeps in at certain moments that they could get better at, right?
And that's what it is. It's this binary black or white world. It's like
Yes.
either you have it or you don't. And I would say it goes even farther in the sense that I think sometimes we think you either have it or you don't, and we can't train that ability, which is
Yes.
which would be the
Totally.
equivalent of me saying, you know, if you or I went and, you know, we were with our buddies at the pool and doing a swim workout, and one goes like, I've never learned how to swim. And we go, up, I guess you're screwed. You're never going to swim in your life.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And it's
Yeah.
like, no one has taught this person how to swim.
Yep.
Like, they probably can figure it out to a good degree if someone like gives them the tools to understand how to do that. And
Yep.
I think the same is with our mental health is like, sometimes, yeah, some people, you know, figure out some of these skills for themselves, but like we need to have some of that scaffolding to understand like, hey, like here are the tools that you can develop and here's some paths to developing them.
Right. Yeah. And I always say, like, most people are like, is there a thing as mental illness? Is there such thing as mental illness? Sure. Just the same way there is physical illness out there. And sometimes that requires treatment and therapy and pharmaceuticals, right? Like, I'm not denying any of that, but just the way most people that have kind of physical issues that are holding them back are things they can train out of, right? They can eat better, they can start exercising, they can sleep better, they can train exactly the terminology I tend to use, like you can train your way out of it. You do the same thing with your mental health. Most people are not mentally ill, they are mentally out of shape to some level, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I would, you know, like, again, I'm not trying to diagnose mental illness here, but like I grew up with, you know, a mild to moderate version of obsessive compulsive disorder.
Sure.
And you know what, like the therapy to, you know, that worked for me was essentially exposure response, which is essentially this. It's like something triggers my OCD, right? And then what I do is I feel a lot of anxiety around it and then like try and cope by, you know, washing your hands a bunch or whatever the OCD thing is. And the therapy is essentially training, which is, you know, your therapist tells
Right.
you what
Yeah.
triggers it. Okay, I want you to just go stare at the thing that triggers it and just keep telling yourself, I'm all right. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have to react in this way. Like, I don't have to, you know, go clean my hands or do this elaborate ritual. I'm okay. And eventually what happens, again, severe cases differ, but like eventually what happens is your brain realizes like, all right,
Yep.
we don't have to respond in the way that we've always responded. We have other options.
Yes.
And that's, you know, I think when it comes to the brain, we forget that the brain is adaptable to, you know, to training. No different than if I wanted to, again, if I had a strained hamstring, I wouldn't just go up, hamstring strained. I better never use my hamstring again. No, you'd go in and
Right.
you'd do some rehab. And at
Yeah.
first it would be like really light. And then you'd like push the bounds and start lifting heavy. So you strengthen it even more. And often the same thing occurs with, you know, mental health is like, we've got to flex the muscle. I think too often what happens is like, we've been told or taught or just never trained in that. So it's difficult to get started.
Right. And the thing you say about the therapist, I mean, like, that's another thing that I think we just need to, we need to think about it differently, frame it differently, where if you hire a personal trainer, a performance coach or whatever, your statement isn't, I'm sick, I'm ill. It is, hey, I'm out of shape and I need some help. I need some nutrition advice. I need some coaching. I need someone to help me kind of like get an exercise routine together. And yet you go to therapy, it's like, I'm sick, you know, I'm ill. And it should be like, no, I've got some mental patterns that I need help breaking out of, right? Like I'm a little bit mentally out of shape here, you know, and I wish we would kind of couch it that way. Cause I just think it's just such a much better way to think about it in the first place, you know?
So I want to one
Go
more
ahead.
point on this because I think it's really important is that there was actually a study that was done not too long ago that looked at implementing some of the mental health or therapy strategies for kids in school.
Mm.
And at first, what they found is it didn't work. And one of the reasons they found it didn't work is because they framed it as this is about like you're not exactly, but close enough. Like, essentially there's something wrong. You're sick. We
Oh,
need to, do this thing. Right. And what happens is when you framed it instead as, this isn't a label, meaning essentially you don't have this disease. It's not a disease,
yes,
right?
it's not a disease.
You are not the disorder, right? It's not, I am OCD, right?
Yes.
That's not it. It's just that my brain right now works in this way or has this pattern. And when you frame the training as like, not addressing this label, but it's essentially like strength and development.
Yes.
It tends to have a better outcome and a better effect. So I think sometimes on this stuff, you're spot on is how we talk about it and how we label things can impact our perception of what we're doing. And that perception can impact like our potential and what we get out of it.
Yeah, totally. Because you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, especially when we internalize it to the point where we make it part of our identity, right? We say like, I am an anxious person. That's just the way I am. I'm an anxious person, right? Like you've made it part of you. I would say one step removed from that is like people would say like, I have anxiety, which is sort of like, again, well, what do you mean you have it? Like you caught it, like it's a disease, like it's a bacteria or something like you have the flu. Like, no, like the real way I think to talk about those things is like, I'm engaging in some anxious behaviors right now. And I'm sort of perpetuating that, like that's the right way to think about those things.
Yeah. It's the difference between like being and experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
If you're being
and
the thing,
doing,
being and doing, right.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Like,
yeah. I'm doing anxiety. That's
right.
What
that's what it is. But it's like, if I'm being the thing, it's really hard to break that.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you see it as like your literal sense of self, and your brain, like your brain is smart. It's predictive. If it keeps getting internalized, like I am this thing, then you essentially create this self-fulfilling prophecy where your brain says, okay, whenever X happens, like I respond in this way because this is who I am.
Yes.
Well, it's not. Right. We can rewire and retrain that to a degree, depending on your severity, but we can rewire and retrain that. And I think how we talk about it, and it's easy to fall into that pattern. I do myself as well. But like, we need to retrain that because like it impacts whether you can do something about it or whether you feel like this is who I am. I'm stuck with it, like deal with it.
Right. Right. So to that point, as you sort of went on your own journey here and started to work with, it started kind of like, okay, this is important. I got to like spend some time on this. It's not just diet and running drills and things like that. What were the first things that you thought you could kind of work, or I guess better question maybe is like, what were the things you started to see commonalities with athletes of like, this is a tendency that many of them seem to have that can be retrained, and how'd you go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of what I saw was what I would call like the external pressures and expectations that were getting blown out of the world. Meaning you could see, and you saw it on the highest level down to high school athletes, you could see people lining up to the starting line, standing, at the kickoff. And it looked like, and if you talk to them afterwards, it felt like the weight of the freaking world was on their shoulders. And when we're in that state, most of us don't perform to our potential. So a lot of it was this is getting perspective or zooming out on like, especially in athletics, what does this mean to you and where are the pressures coming from? Because when those pressures feel like the weight of the world, you're going to default towards like surviving and avoiding, because your brain's going to be like, hey, like if this is it, I'm going to check out and, essentially play dead instead of allow you to perform to your potential, because like I want to avoid the situation and this feeling. So a lot of it was kind of like rewiring people in the sense to say, like, instead of seeing this thing as like a negative and avoidance, to see that pressure, that little bit of anxiety that comes with it is your body preparing you to do a difficult thing. And this is what the framing on this is seeing the thing as a threat or a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning you see it as a threat, your brain goes stress hormones through the roof, like avoid, just survive the thing, whatever. If you see it as a challenge, what happens? Your body goes, okay, we're going to give you a little bit more adrenaline instead of cortisol. And what that does is it gives you a little anxiety, but it's also got a tinge of excitement in there, because I'm taking on the thing.
Yeah.
I might not always succeed, but this is a challenge that I chose to sign up to and that I want to do, and that like reflects, on my values and my drives. And I think that was number one. I think the other thing that I saw a lot of is, I call it the angel and devil on our shoulder, which means we all have these inner voices where there's that voice that is telling us like, keep going, push yourself, reach your goal. And then there's that other voice, the devil, that is telling us, hey, why don't you quit? Why don't you find a hole to step in? Why don't you like duck into the bathrooms so that, no one knows where you are and you don't have to go out there on the field? And really, first off, is accepting. I think so many people don't realize it, but like basically everybody has those same voices, even the top of the top.
Of course. Yes.
And when we're experiencing it, it feels like it's just us. And we interpret it as, I'm so weak, I want to quit. And part of getting over that is realizing, first, everybody has those voices. There's a reason everybody has those voices, because your brain needs and wants to protect you. So what it's doing is saying, hey, this is going to be really difficult. Are you sure you want to do this?
Right.
And it's essentially double checking, right? But like, just because it's trying to like, protect us doesn't mean that we have to listen to that voice. So it's like, how do we navigate that? Sometimes it's understanding that it's there and just accepting, hey, that's part of it, whatever. Sometimes it's countering it with like, no, I'm going to give more evidence to this other voice. Sometimes it's using tools where you understand, okay, I'm going to create a little bit of distance between that voice. This is why athletes sometimes talk to themselves in third person, because it like has a little different ring to it than keep saying like, I or whatever have you. So it's using these tools to all figure out, okay, how do I navigate this inner world?
Yeah. There's something you said there, which I think is so interesting, which is essentially things like whether it's excitement or nervousness or exercise, those can all feel almost exactly the same physiologically.
Yep.
Right. And however, the hormonal release behind those, whether it's cortisol or adrenaline or testosterone, a lot of that has to do with the perspective we have on whatever it is, right? Like, that feeling of like nervousness can feel exactly like excitement if we sort of like really objectify it. But like the way it impacts us has so much to do with what we believe about that feeling and the scenario. Am I right on that? Like, I mean, I've heard you talk about this.
You're spot on. You're spot on. And what the current psychology and research tells us is that our emotions or those feelings need context.
Yeah, right. Right.
And we are providing that context.
And the context is a choice. That's the most important piece of it, right? It's not like set in stone, right?
Right.
You can be so like, let's take something like skydiving as an example. You can be terrified of skydiving, or you can love skydiving. And I think a lot of times we feel like that might be an extreme example. Remember, people are like, I'm never doing that. However, theoretically, you could choose the way you feel about that, right?
Yeah. And that interpretation affects not only your psychology, but your biology.
Yes, right.
And that is the key thing, is that like we get to layer on that context. The way I like to frame this is the latest neuroscience tells us our brain is predictive, meaning it's trying to predict how we should handle the task before us.
Yes.
How it makes those predictions are the information that we feed it. So part of it is, yeah, the information, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, but part of that information is we add the context to it.
Yeah. I actually think it even goes beyond that. I can't even remember where I heard this, and I may botch this a little bit, but essentially the way we perceive the world is a prediction. It's like it very, the way we perceive it, the way we sort of experience the world is like a split second prediction before the thing actually happens. Because of like our brain, to your point, is trying to make sense of things. And so it's constructing things in a way that it actually hasn't quite happened yet in a very, very small, am I right on that?
Yeah, spot on. Let me give you an example to make this clear for folks. So a couple years ago, I don't know, many will remember this, but around the internet, you had this controversy over this dress.
Oh yeah, I remember this. Yeah.
You remember this?
Yeah, I do.
Right?
Yeah. Different color, right? Yeah.
Different colors. And some people would swear, I forget the exact colors.
It was gold, and one of them was gold and some other color. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like gold and we'll say blue.
Yeah,
I don't remember exactly,
either.
but
okay.
Yeah, but some people would swear, I see this dress as gold. What are you talking about? You see it as blue, like you've lost your mind. What this is, and what researchers found, is that how we saw that dress depended on what prediction our brain was making.
Right.
And what they found is essentially this. I'm simplifying, but they found is that if for whatever reason your brain thought a light was shining on the dress, you saw it as gold. If you thought that it was in a room without like a direct light, your brain predicted it as blue. And we literally experienced and saw the different color based on our brain making a different prediction.
Yeah.
The same thing happens, right? When we're doing sports, when we're taking on a challenge, when we're doing whatever we are difficult, right? Only the difference here is, instead of like the light determining it, like a large part of what determines it is like the context that we're feeding it, or our experience and what we've brought to the table, that is our brain's gonna pull on and say, hey, before we even get to the thing, I think this is gonna happen, right?
Yeah.
And so you're gonna see it in this way. And the way I like to frame it to people is like, what information are you feeding your brain, right? What context are you giving it? What evidence are you giving it in terms of like your preparation? So leading up to the performance, are you feeding it with stuff that like tells you I'm ready to go? Or are you feeding it with stuff that tells you, I'm not? And I'll give you an example of this. Is I think it was in professional hockey players, ice hockey players, when they, right before a game, when they showed and went through game tape of them previously doing well, they got a bump in testosterone by something like 44%. When they showed them game tape right before getting on the rink or in the ice of where they messed up last time, and maybe even what they could do better, but it was focused on where you messed up last time, so don't do this. No bump in testosterone. Why? Because your brain goes, oh, you're telling me I'm getting evidence that I screw up a lot and I'm not prepared and I'm about to go out on the ice right now. The alternative is you give yourself evidence of like, hey, I'm good. I've succeeded in the past. Why am I worried about stepping onto the ice? I've done it before. I can do it again. So even in those crucial moments before you're about to do the thing, like the evidence you're presenting yourself also shapes like what way hormonally and then what way psychologically we go.
Yeah. So with the people you work with, then, is this the kind of thing that you have them do? Are there other specific exercises that you have them engage in?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of what I do is a bunch of it is setting yourself up to perform. So when we get closer to a performance, that's game or activity or whatever it is, we have this kind of sensitive window where your brain is on high alert for like, okay, which way should we go on this like threat or challenge? And we need essentially to prime ourselves to give us the evidence that we are confident and we can do the thing. So that looks at like, what are you feeding your brain? What are you watching? What are you listening to? And the second part of that is we need to give ourselves some sort of routine that convinces us that we're in control. Meaning, often when we get into the step into whatever arena it is, it's uncertain, it's chaotic, and we often feel like, hey, I've lost control here. I don't know if I can do what I should do. And what research tells us is that once we feel like our sense of control or impact on the thing is gone, we essentially shut down. Our brain goes into why try mode. What's the point?
Mm.
So even in highly uncertain situations where we might not have much control, what research tells us is that if we can grasp on to like something simple that we do have control over, our brain goes, okay, we have a shot. And this is why every athlete has like a pre-game routine.
Yes. Rituals. Yeah, for sure.
Rituals, because what it does is it says, I'm in control. I've been here before. I've done these things before. This is how I get ready to do the thing. Even if there's a lot of, I don't know how the thing's going to turn out, I'm doing the thing.
Yep.
And that's what we look at. So on that front end. And then the second thing that I think is really important is, especially when we look at failures, is a lot of what I spend time on doing. And you guys are experts at this, but like, how do you process and internalize what just happened so it becomes information that helps you going forward versus something that is almost a little bit traumatic
Yeah.
and fearful,
Yep.
that puts you in a place, well, last time I stepped out onto the field, I failed, and I remember feeling this way afterwards. So developing some way to like process, understand, and then take the information forward that we need to like, that will help us, while leaving behind the kind of like negative emotional baggage that will like get in our way in the future.
The ritual thing is interesting because there's the sort of maxim out there of like neurons that fire together, wire together, right? And so those things can be really effective because if you develop some kind of ritual that you associate with good feelings and confidence and all that, like even like the song that pumps you up the most, and like develop a little body routine and everything, your brain then says, okay, when I hear this song and I do this thing, I feel confident. And so regardless of the situation, like if you do, like you trigger it and it'll automatically kind of go there, right? The same way that the music's a good example because it's the same thing that happens to us. And we say this too, like, oh, I hear that song and it makes me think blah, 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 makes me think. And that is exactly what's happening. It is, you have some memory that was really impactful for whatever reason tied to a piece of music. And then when the music comes on, your brain has wired the neurons of that memory into that song. And that's what it triggers, right? And we sort of brush that aside as like, oh, that's cool. And it's like, that's a really useful tool. You can use that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example. The music is perfect because we've all had that experience where a song that maybe we haven't heard for a while comes on and it triggers that feeling, that memory, that experience, and puts us almost in that place. The same thing happens when we perform. And
Yep.
a song can do that. A ritual can do that. Whatever your routine can do that. Putting on your jersey. This is why athletes
Yeah, sure.
save their jersey for game day, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like what it does, and there's some wonderful research that essentially tells us this as well, in addition to rituals and routines, is that our environment signals who we should be. So when we put that jersey on, what it signals is like, okay, I'm becoming Steve the competitor. And think about this. We all know this because like what happens, for instance, you get dressed up in, nice clothes Sunday to go to church and you act differently, even though you might not consciously be trying to do it.
Yeah,
You
right.
act differently than maybe you do a couple hours later when you take the nice clothes off and get out of the church and you're watching the football game with your friends.
Yep.
Because everything around you is signaling like, hey, behave in this sort of manner. We can do the same thing when it comes to performing, whether it's your jersey, your gear, what you wear, the things around you. And actually some fascinating work, even in the workplace, shows that there was a wonderful study that found that when you have pictures on your desk in the workplace that remind you why you're there, meaning either some sort of notable quote or phrase, or even a picture of your family who you're supporting, like doing the work, you're going to experience less burnout, perform better, and act more ethically at work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You have people
Because
watching you.
you got that, because it reminds you, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, this isn't just me, like people are essentially watching you. And I think we sometimes discount all of this by not understanding like, hey, who do you want to invite to show up? That's how I phrase it with the people I work with. Who do you want to invite to show up? What kind of attitude do you want? What kind of focus do you want? And then we've got to craft our world around it, whether it's our routine, the music we're listening to, the things that we're wearing, to make sure that that person shows up.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book a little bit, or sorry, your most recent book, and you have many books, but Win the Inside Game. Was your inspiration for writing this kind of everything that's been going on these last couple of years, or was there a specific thing that made you want to write this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it was is it was everything that was going on, but what I really experienced is that I think there's so much now in the world of social media and online stuff that pushes us to essentially play the what I'd call the external game, which is like chase the accolades, the followers, the likes, everything in that regard, which is getting away from what I've seen in high performers, which actually allows us to like perform up to our potential. And we've talked about this a little bit, but in the book, I quote a coach by the name of Tom House, who originally was a baseball pitching coach for the Texas Rangers, but went on to coach Nolan Ryan and Randy Johnson, and then helped Tom Brady and Drew Brees with their throwing. And when I asked him, what did all those greats of the greats have in common? He said it wasn't their desire to win. He said they were obsessed with the process. And what the process was for them is like, I want to be the best at getting better. Yes. And like, these are the things that I need to do to get better, which to me is like the inside game of like, forget the noise out there, right? Of people telling me, do this, compare to this, like live up to that. It's breaking it down to the simple things of, if my goal and my job is to be the best quarterback or pitcher I can be, like, what are the simple steps and the things that truly matter? And more so, I think, the people in my life who I need to surround myself with, who matter and care and support me, not all these other voices out here that are telling me other stuff.
Yeah. That process thing is so important. Like that's such an important insight for anybody of like, whatever it is you do in life, you have to fall in love with the process. Like if you're not in love with the process, you don't really like the thing, whatever it is, whether it's running or soccer or work, whatever. Like if it's all about an end state and you don't dig the process, it's not your thing.
That's what it is. And I think it's like so simple to say, but it's so important because so many people get lost where they think, oh, this end state, this, whether it's financial or whatever, reputational, this is going to be able to drive me. But what the research and the experience of world-class performers tells us is that like, if that's all you got, you might burn bright for a little bit,
Yeah.
but that's not that thing. If you don't love that process, it's not going to be able to get you through what we talked about at the beginning. Those those lows and failure points and tough points that are inevitably are going to come because they come to everyone, even the best in the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think it's one of those things where we miss the mark a lot, where we talk a lot about goals and achievements and end states, and we don't talk enough about processes. It's like spend some time figuring out the processes you enjoy. Like what processes fire you up, you know? And there's a quote in I don't actually know if it's in the book, but in the movie Dune, the guy says something like, you know, life is not a mystery to be solved. It's a process to engage in. Right. And like, I loved that line in that movie, whether it's, again, I've read the book, but I don't remember if it's in there, but I was just like, yes, that is exactly right. That's kind of the secret sauce there. You, you start this book off with this whistleblower story, which again, I knew nothing about. So just for people that aren't familiar with that, because this was a big part of your life. Can you kind of quickly cover that? And I'm curious why you clearly that made a difference for the book, like to kick it off there. So why go over that in terms of starting the book off?
Yeah, so here's the basic gist of it is very early on in my coaching career, I got what I thought was my dream job, which was coaching a group of Olympic level track athletes as part of a Nike team with, you know, some famous coaches and famous runners. And it quickly turned into nightmare, meaning I saw some things that, you know, broke rules in the sport and like push boundaries. And about a year and a half into that journey, I left and then blew the whistle on things that I saw and experienced. And long story short is that that took about 10 years of my life before it got finally, you know, figured out through all the anti world and US anti-doping like
Yeah.
rules and like regulations and lawyers and all that stuff. And it ended up happening the coach and the doctor got, you know, banned from sport because of it. So it turned out, you know, on my side well, but the reason I started it out that is I wanted to really hit people with something that was hard,
Mm,
that challenged me, and then challenged me in a way that wasn't like black or white of like, look at me, I did the right thing and I'm the hero, because I started off by telling people about a point where, yeah, I eventually blew the whistle, but I started off by telling people about a point where I struggled with it and like wasn't sure and just kind of went along with what the doctor and coach desired, because like I was like, I have no idea. At that point, I think I was, I don't know, mid early 20s. And I was like, I don't know what to do. This is my job. This is where I thought I could be. And I couldn't solve that problem or have the courage to do what I think is the right thing in that moment. It took time.
mm, okay. Huh. I've never met a whistleblower before. You're the first whistleblower.
Well,
I've ever
you know,
met.
let me tell you, it sucks. You know, not that it sucks. It's good that you come out and do it, but it's a long, hard road for a number of reasons. And I think, you know, sometimes you get a reputation for it, but I think like in this case, we had not only, you know, cheating in sport, but some very bad environmental stuff with some of the women on the team that they were going through. And sometimes you gotta do the right thing regardless of what the consequences are.
Yeah, I mean, like that's tough. I think for a lot of us, it's interesting because I think people feel differently about that term depending on where it's used and who, you know,
Yep.
the situation and all of that. But sort of on its foundational level anyway, it should be a good thing. To your point, it's about like it, and that's why there's like laws around it protecting people, because like the whole point is that you are exposing something that needs to be exposed because it's wrong. That's what it is, right?
And that's at the essence of it. And I remember when I going through that process of saying like, okay, should I blow the whistle or not?
Yeah.
One of the things that made me want to do it is I thought about my life and I thought, you know what? If I knew what I knew now, would I have ever signed up for this thing? And that the answer was absolutely not, because it didn't fit with, my values or the rules of sport or like what I wanted out of things. I would have said no. And the reality is at that point, like even they were even getting teenagers into that program. So from my standpoint, I was just like, you know what, whatever happens, people need to know so that they can make their own choices and decisions and go
Yeah.
in with clear eyes. And I think that we owe that to individuals, whether we're talking sport or other things, is like you want to know what you're getting into to a large degree. And I think people, especially when it comes to jobs or like, professional things, they have the right to do so.
Yeah. Your book has 3 parts: be, do, belong. And we've talked a little bit, I think, about being and doing, but we haven't talked anything really about belonging. And you make a distinction between fitting in and belonging. So talk a little bit about that and kind of what that looks like in terms of winning the inside game.
Yeah, absolutely. So fitting in is this. It's essentially middle school. When we change ourselves and our beliefs and our ethics and our morals and our values just to be a part of something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think far too often what has happened now, because we have the data on it, we have an epidemic of like loneliness and disconnection, and we have less and less, belonging, especially if you look at the data in men, especially, is we kind of get desperate and we just want to fit in. We just want others around us because it's a basic human need to belong. And my argument is that, like, for both our mental and physical health, we need more of actual genuine belonging, which is like bringing yourself to the table or the group and forming a connection that like enhances everybody. Meaning, I understand who you are, Chris, and you understand who I am. And we might not agree on fundamentally everything, but we respect each other. And I think this is what you see at deeper levels, especially in the, Navy SEALs. You see this on some teams where when you've gone through something challenging, that, together with someone else, you feel a deeper level of connection to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize that, like, even if we've been apart and haven't seen each other for maybe years, you can still pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm going to talk to Chris or I'm going to talk to Steve. And I know that they're going to support me and they got my back and we're going to figure these things out. And I think in a world that pushes us to the superficial, we need more of that genuine belonging and connection. And what research tells us is when we feel connected to others and we feel that belonging in our life, it changes how we see challenges. So at the beginning, we talked about threat and challenge responses. If you feel supported, you will have a challenge response. There was a wonderful study that took partners, couples, married couples, and they stuck them in a fMRI machine to look at what's going on in their brain. And what they did is, for the woman lying there getting their brain scanned, okay, they essentially either brought something that was scary to them, like a snake or a spider, and put it next to them, or delivered an electric shock that was painful to them. And they saw what was happening in the brain. And unsurprisingly, their fear and threat centers and pain centers go through the roof. When they ran that experiment and had their significant other holding their hand, pain centers, threat centers, fear centers go up significantly less. And what was most interesting here is the higher rated the relationship was, meaning before they went in to get everything scanned, they did all these questionnaires, got interviewed, and got rated on the strength of their relationship. The stronger the relationship is, the stronger the suppressing effect was on their fear threat centers. Meaning, if you're in a strong relationship and your partner is there, fear centers go up only a little bit. Why? Because we have the fundamental need to belong. And when we have the support around us, we know that we can essentially share the load. We're not there alone. And I think, again, in a world that is kind of isolated and superficial, if we can find that genuine connection, it's almost like a superpower.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's something that comes up over and over, right? And it's something like, people say it all the time about like evolved this way as social creatures and blah, 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 right? I think the hardest part for me, like I find this challenging these days. I think it's of all of this stuff, like the internal game, so to speak, everything else you can work on by yourself, right? It's internal. So it kind of goes with that. But there is so much about the way we feel that really is related to other people. But I do find it to be the hardest thing, like how you do it in the modern day and age, because so many people like myself work remotely. I'm not around coworkers physically in any way. So you lose all the water cooler, so to speak, quote unquote water cooler interactions, all the just kind of bullshitting. You just don't have that. It's like you're either on a Zoom call where you're talking about in a meeting or you're just by yourself. And that's kind of the way it is. So you sort of have lost that. And if you're working remotely, I don't know that there's a way to get it back. And then, maybe your close friends, you don't from high school or college or sports or whatever, like you're not living near them anymore. So you almost have to like force yourself to go find some, like this is what our grandparents did, like bowling league or poker night or something. Are there other ways that you found to do that? Like, how to like go cultivate a local community where, because it's not going to necessarily come find you, right?
You've nailed I think one of the central problems of our time
Yes.
is we've made it really difficult, and
Yeah.
the environment around us has made it, damn near impossible in some regards. Everything is set up against, that in-person connection. And for some, it's a good reason. Like you, like I work from home, so I
Yeah.
don't have that, anymore as well. But I think the answer is, I wish there was a simple answer, but I think being more proactive and almost forcing your way to
Yeah.
it
I think you
is the
have to.
path. I
Yeah.
think you have to. And I think there is something to learn from our grandparents on this. Is what did they do? They formed local communities based on hobbies and interest and things that they could connect to. And I think that in a world that pushes us to more online and social media and superficial connections, we've got to figure out, how do we get back to our local community? And again, you can have friends all over. I do, you do, that's great. But we still need some sort of real life interaction at some point. And like, how do we foster that? And there's data and research on, especially with men tend to bond more doing stuff.
Yeah.
So, and I think part of it is we've minimized doing stuff as much, right? There's less craftsmanship and hobbies around that. And I think this is partly why, especially for men, and once you get middle age, like things like, triathlons and running and high rocks and CrossFit, like these things start to take off, because like they're
Yeah.
one of the few places where it's like, okay, I can do things with other people.
Yep. Yeah.
And
That's my thing is CrossFit, and that's what I do. And that's a big piece of it. It's a big piece of it.
Bingo, right?
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
that's great. And this is where I think these especially in athletics, it's like a great thing to have. But I think we've got to offer or figure out how to force our way into more of those things. It's
Yeah.
the old, we
do.
need more bowling leagues or
Yeah.
whatever it is,
we need to, we do. I mean, I find this in my own life all the time now. It's just, you have to figure out a way to wedge yourself into, and like, I think make choices where it's like, given the choice between a virtual thing and an in-person thing, choose the in-person thing. Like even when you feel like, oh, the virtual thing, I can just sit in my pajamas and whatever. It's like, choose. And the other one, man, is like politics. It's like get away from national politics that in a lot of ways have nothing to do with you, and start, if you're, if you want to affect that, go local. Like look at your town, like in the politics there, right? Like work on like local stuff, not the national crap that you wouldn't even know was happening if you didn't turn the news on. I think is
well, yeah, I think you're spot on. And again, a problem of our time is, what does it do? Is it convinces us to split off into these like national level political tribes, instead of like, spending time and meeting people where they're at in the local community.
Yeah.
And that even means like things that affect you locally. Like, spot on. If you're worried about some politically, go volunteer to help the local school board, or, like something like in that vein that puts us in the real world and stuff. And I think the other thing that happens there is that this is why we need more in-person local stuff, is that you drop the like two-dimensional caricature of things
Yeah.
and start seeing the messiness of the real world, which is like,
right.
we can't split everybody into these political tribes or these viewpoints. Like, we're diverse human beings who like all come with different experiences. And when you talk in the real world with people, you start to realize, what, like, Chris and I agree on X, Y, and Z and have different opinions on A, B, and C, but like, he's a good dude. So like these talks help me, instead of seeing like, oh, Chris belongs to the Yankees and I'm a Red Sox fan, and like we can never talk, right?
Right. For me, it'd be the opposite. I'm from Boston, so
there you go. Sorry for getting it.
I'm the kid that was that grew up being told hate the Yankees, right? Like that was that was part of my identity as a kid. So a couple last questions for you here. The one is on mental toughness, and I'm kind of curious on your take on that. And the question I want to ask is, are we relying too much on it? Have we leaned into mental toughness specifically as kind of almost like a Swiss Army knife for mental, struggles or whatever, in a way that it's not always useful? Because that's the way I feel. I feel like it's become almost just like a catchphrase, as if it's a panacea for anything you might be dealing with. But to me, that's not true. Like, it doesn't solve every single thing. In terms of, I guess, when I say mental toughness, I'm sort of referring to just sort of grit, right? Grind through, like just suck it up. What's your cut on that?
I think you're spot on. And what really made this clear to me is an example when I was talking to world-class climbers who climb like Mount Everest and other things. And what they said to me is this, is that when you see the summit and you start to get where you can almost like smell and taste it, your inclination is to essentially be like, forget how I feel, because I probably feel horrible. Just like grit and grind my way to the top.
Yes.
Because the goal matters. And that's why I signed up. This is why I paid all this money. This is what I trained all these years for. Go get it. But they told me, said, you can't do that. Because if you do, what tends to happen is you reach the summit and then you realize you didn't do the calculation of, I have to make it to the summit and I have to make it all the way back down the mountain. So he said, this climber, he said, you have to be very careful of when you use that grit and when you essentially go the opposite way and like zoom out and like, okay, I need to check the instruments. I need to not grit my way through, but like do a calculation on how much fuel do I have, essentially mental, physical fuel. Like, is it better to quit right now? And sometimes like the answer is yes, so that you live and survive another day.
Yeah.
And I think, that analogy, I think, applies to other things. Is if the only tool in your toolbox you have is grit, you might go far, but there's going to be a time and a place where you need a different tool to handle the challenge before you. And if you have not trained it and you have not prepared it, your brain and body are going to default to grit, and you might be in serious trouble or might not be able to solve that problem. So similar to you, the way I like to say it is like, grit, toughness is a great tool to have. I love it. But you got to diversify that toolkit and make sure that you bring other tools to the table, because you never know when you're going to have to use that, weird, strange screwdriver in the back of your toolbox.
Yeah. That's so well said, man. It is exactly that. It is a tool among multiple ones. And like, to me, the real measure of sort of mental fitness is, one, having all those tools, but really knowing which one to use when.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the true test of like exactly what you're saying. Like, okay, I have that tool of grittiness. Is this the right time to use that? Right. That's the real test. So the last thing I want to ask you is just looping all the way back to kind of identity is what should we, like, how should we define ourselves, so to speak? Like, where should we use that term, and where is it helpful and where is it unhelpful? And I'm thinking about things like, again, going back to kind of my experience of sort of veterans and people that spend a long time in a job where it is part of their identity, right? I come from a background where for a long time you say, I'm a Navy SEAL. I am a Navy SEAL. And then one day you're not. And for a lot of people, that's such a shift that it really knocks them off their game and they don't even know who they are anymore. And on some level, I think it can be beneficial at that point to go, you know what? That was a job. Like I was doing Navy SEAL stuff, but it's not who I am. And I think that can be healthy. Recognizing it was a great job and, like, you know, made you who you are in a lot of ways. What's your kind of cut on that for, for everybody, all walks of life there? Like where should you use that terminology and where shouldn't you potentially?
I think, yeah, this is at the heart of being a human, I think. What I would say there is a couple things is you've gotta, when it comes to your identity, you've gotta know and be careful of what you marry. Meaning, once you marry, it's really hard to separate, right? Especially when it comes
I like
to identity.
that idea of marrying it. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's relatively easy, and we want to, like, loving is easier, right? It still means we care a lot about it. We love the thing, but we're not quite married to it. So I would say in your pursuits is like, just be careful what you're marrying it, and know that, like, with a real marriage, like, at some point it's going to suck when your partner, dies or departs or leaves. And for some of us, like, that could be, Navy SEAL or job or what have you, and understanding that at the get-go. The second part that I would say is that you've got to be able, there's this phrase in sport that I love, is like, you've got to be able to take the jersey off and still know who you are.
Yeah, good.
So to me, what that means is understanding that even when I'm loving, or possibly even marrying the pursuit, is to understand I've got to have enough other things that contribute to me, my sense of self, that once I take that jersey off, I'm still going to feel secure and pretty whole, so that I can weather that storm of, like, saying goodbye to this thing that I used to do. So that means, like, diversifying my identity, diversifying my sources of meaning. It means, like, understanding that I'm not just a Navy SEAL or a runner, but also, a husband, a provider. I'm interested in XYZ, tying back to our hobby discussion. I might not consider all my hobbies part of my identity, but collectively, maybe they make up a part of who I am. And diversifying ourselves just enough so that, if the main thing takes a hit or we have to move on from it, we're not going from, we're not hitting an identity crisis, essentially.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's end it there, man. Are there any kind of major points from the book or elsewhere that we didn't touch on that you just want to bring up real quickly for folks?
Oh man, I don't know. We covered a lot, so I probably could, but we'll just settle there. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, dude, that was awesome. I loved it. It was a great conversation. If people want to connect with you, work with you, check out more of your stuff, where should they go?
Yeah, so you can head on over to stevemagness.com, or I'm on basically any social media at Steve Magness, Twitter, X, Instagram, YouTube, you name it. So check it out.
Awesome. Most recent book, Win the Inside Game. Check it out. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it, man.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanics Wear. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.